Hello and welcome to Dining with Death. This episode is on my playlist, Dining with the Damned, where we talk about criminals who have been sentenced to die. We talk about their lives and their crimes and how they ended up on death row, and then I show you and taste their last meal. I'm Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Gary Mark Gilmore was a man who committed 2 known murders in northern Utah, but he became somewhat infamous not just for his crimes, but for his controversial request when the time came to execute him for those crimes. He was born Fay Robert Kaufman, but his mother changed his name early in his life. He was born in McCamey, Texas on December 4th, 1940, to Frank and Bessie Gilmore. His father was a drunk who had multiple families and didn't support any of them. He married Bessie on kind of a whim in Sacramento, California, after Bessie was cast out from her family in Provo, Utah. Gary's father took off not long after his birth, and years later, Gary found his original birth certificate with the name Fay Robert Kaufman on it. He became enraged at his mother for lying to him and enraged at his father for abandoning the family. You know I'm all about these common threads in these kinds of people, and I find it very interesting. Gary Gilmore was very angry about being deceived about his birth name. And then, of course, the most famous example is Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy thought his sister was his sister when she was actually his mother. I just find those kinds of things fascinating, what those do to certain people. Some people can have things like that happen and not be that bothered by them. But then other people find out about things like that and they carry it with them their whole life. Gary's mother moved him around a lot as a child, and he never really had a sense of a secure home. His father came in and out of his life and made small amounts of money by selling magazine subscriptions, and most of those were fake magazine subscriptions. Gary's brothers said their father was a cruel and unreasonable man. He was strict and easily angered and was also physically abusive to the children. He was physically abusive to his wife as well, something we see in almost every one of these cases. The family finally settled in Portland, Oregon in 1952, and by the time he was a young teenager, Gary Gilmore was committing petty crimes. Gary was smart, with an IQ of 133, and he had artistic talents as well, but he dropped out of school in the 9th grade and ran away from home. He did return several months afterwards. When he was 14, he started a small car theft ring, which resulted in his first arrest, but that didn't stop him. He continued to steal cars and continued being arrested for stealing cars for years to come. His father died while he was in jail on one of these arrests, and that made him really angry. After the guard told him of his father's death, Gary made a suicide attempt, saying he was devastated. When he did finally get out of jail, he started drinking heavily. In 1964, he was charged with assault and armed robbery and was sent back to prison, where a prison psychiatrist diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder. He was released in 1972 and allowed to live in a halfway house in Eugene, Oregon, where he was supposed to enroll as an art student in community college. He didn't take the opportunities given to him. He never enrolled in college, and just a month after his release to the halfway house, he was arrested again and convicted of armed robbery. He had been violent several times in prison, and so this time he was sent to a maximum security prison in Marion, Illinois. He was again paroled in April of 1976, despite all of his criminal and violent behavior, with no type of rehabilitation or treatment whatsoever. Today is the day of talking about things we see all the time, because we see that all the time. People are sent to prison for short periods of time, absolutely no rehabilitation, absolutely no counseling, absolutely no treatment, released back out onto the streets, and then they continue their behavior, and a lot of times that behavior escalates and gets much worse, and then someone loses their life. It makes me angry. When are we going to learn that it just doesn't work to lock people up? They have to be rehabilitated. They have to be treated, and if they're not, it's just going to continue. I don't have all the answers, but I know what we're doing isn't working. Gary moved to Provo, Utah to live with his distant cousin, who was trying to help him out. People gave him work. They employed him. They gave him the opportunity to better his life, but he chose instead to keep stealing, to keep drinking heavily, and to keep getting into fights. He had a girlfriend who was only 19 years old, and she already had 2 small children. Her name was Nicole Barrett Baker. The two had an intense but tumultuous relationship, and after Gary was violent with her on many occasions, Nicole finally broke off the relationship. This breakup seemed to awaken an even more violent side of Gary Gilmore. If there was an actual timeline of how to predict a murder, this would be the case. A lot of times it's some kind of an emotional crisis that takes place in these people's lives before they commit a terrible crime. On July 19th, 1976, Gary Gilmore went inside a gas station in Orem, Utah. The station attendant was a young man named Max Jensen, who was a newlywed attending BYU and working at the gas station to support he and his young wife. Max took the job because the couple really needed money, but he looked at it as a temporary thing until something better came along. His shift went from 3 o'clock to 11 p.m. that night. Gary Gilmore had purchased a truck, promising to find a co-signer for the loan. But when everyone he asked to act as a co-signer refused, he stated to the lender that he would get the money himself and have the truck paid off in a couple of weeks. He then turned to what he knew best, robbing, to make that happen. With his ex-girlfriend Nicole's sister in the truck with him, Gary pulled into the Sinclair station where Max Jensen was working, and he told her that he would be right back. She saw him walk around the corner of the building and disappear into the Sinclair station. Gary spotted Max Jensen, and when he saw no one else was around, he pulled a gun on the attendant and told him to empty his pockets, which Max did. Gary then ordered Max into the station bathroom and told him to lie down on the ground with his arms under his body. Max did exactly as he was told, but Gary Gilmore stood over the attendant and said, "This one's for me," and pulled the trigger. He then said, "And this one's for Nicole," and pulled it again. Max Jensen had been murdered in cold blood. Gary Gilmore was surprised at how quickly the blood flowed, and he was upset to see it on the cuffs of his pants. He panicked, not even taking the cash from the register. He went back to his truck and took his ex-girlfriend's sister to a movie theater where they saw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest together. He then got a motel room and the two went inside. Meanwhile, back at the gas station, a customer had entered the Sinclair station and found Max Jensen's body. The customer alerted the police, and as Gary Gilmore sat watching a movie, the hunt for him was on. The following day, Gary had problems with his new truck, and he took it to a service station close to his Uncle Vern's house, which is where he had been staying. The mechanic told Gary that the fix would only take about 20 minutes, so Gary told him he was going to go run an errand, and he would be back for the truck when it was fixed. Gary walked out of the mechanic's shop and down the road to where he saw the City Center Motel. He got an idea for some quick cash. He walked into the lobby and found the manager, 25-year-old BYU student and expectant father Ben Bushnell, behind the desk. Ben had just returned from the store, and he asked Gary how he could help him. Gary Gilmore pulled out a gun and told Ben to give him all the cash in the cash box and get down on the floor. Ben did exactly as he was told. Gary then shot Bushnell in the head, but Bushnell did not die. He was struggling to try and crawl away, and as all of this was happening, Ben's pregnant wife, Debbie, came from the back room and saw what was going on. Gary Gilmore grabbed the cash box and ran as Debbie knelt down by her husband and held his head in her lap as he died. That's a really awful story, and it gets even worse because Debbie said that for years and years afterwards, she couldn't get remarried. She was only 24 years old, widowed at 24, and she had really bad PTSD. The sight of blood would just send her into a tailspin. It really affected her life. Gary stuffed the cash box under a bush to hide it, and as he walked on, he bent over at another bush to hide the gun that he had used. But the branch of that bush caught the trigger of the gun, pulled it back, and fired. Gary Gilmore had shot himself in the hand. I mean, honestly, it is amazing that some of these guys make it to adulthood. It really is. Yeah. Gary walked back to the service station to get his truck, and of course, the owner of the shop, a man named Norman Fulmer, saw the blood. He saw the trail of blood behind Gary. In his office, Norman had a police scanner, and he heard all of the activity, officers responding to a shooting at the motel by his shop. Well, that combined with the blood made it pretty obvious, and he quickly wrote down the license plate on Gary Gilmore's truck, and he called the police. Gary went back to his uncle's house where he got his hand bandaged up, and then he started to panic. He got in his truck and he just decided to take off. He was in such a frenzy that he drove right through a police roadblock, and the police, of course, turned around and followed him. Gary decided to pull over, and he gave up without a fight. He was taken into custody where he began to talk. He made up story after story about how he wasn't the killer. He had been at the movies. He didn't kill Max the night before, etc. All the stuff these guys always say. But the cops knew they had their man. Gilmore went to trial where he argued with his attorneys that he should take the stand, but he ended up changing his mind. During the trial, he seemed to kind of resign himself to his fate. On October 7th, 1976, after an hour and 20 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict for the murder of Ben Bushnell. Gary Gilmore was sentenced to death. He was never put on trial for the murder of Max Jensen. The execution was set for November 15th, not more than a month after the trial. Things were very different back in the 70s with executions, and especially in Utah, where it was still kind of the Wild West. I mean, in some ways, it still is the Wild West here. People talk all the time about Texas. Well, you need to look into Utah. The judge told Gary Gilmore he had a choice. Now remember, this was before the lethal injection was the usual and normal method of execution. So the judge told Gary that he could choose to be hanged or he could choose to die by firing squad. I was 6 years old when this happened. And I'm old, but I'm not that old. A firing squad? It seems unbelievable, but yeah, they were still using firing squads. To everyone's surprise, Gary Gilmore chose death by firing squad because he felt like there was too much of a possibility of a botched hanging. Gary also said he didn't want any appeals process. He wanted to die as soon as possible. The problem was the state law back then gave only 60 days to carry out an execution after it was ordered. Utah hadn't had an execution in 16 years, and as word spread that a man was going to be killed by a firing squad, such an archaic method of execution, it did not sit well with a lot of people. The Supreme Court had suspended all executions from 1972 to 1976, stating they were unconstitutional, and that ban had only been lifted weeks before Gary Gilmore's murders. So there was a lot of controversy surrounding execution at the time. An execution by a firing squad? Absolutely unthinkable. Utah Attorney General at the time, Eric Dorius, admitted he didn't have the slightest clue as to how to go about putting a firing squad together. Gary Gilmore went before the Utah Supreme Court, stating he was ready to die. The execution date of November 15th came and went as the legal wrangling continued. Gary formed a suicide pact with his ex-girlfriend Nicole. She smuggled some pills into the jail for Gary to take, and then she went home and took some pills herself. Both of them were trying to overdose, but they were both found and saved. That shows you just how different things were back then. You could have visitors on death row. A lot of places you can't do that anymore, and if you do, there is certainly a panel of glass between you. The execution was rescheduled for December 6th, but then Gary's mother stepped in and asked for a stay. A stay was granted, and Gary Gilmore went on a hunger strike to protest that stay. 10 days later, the stay was overturned, and the execution was set for a third time for January 17, 1977. The night before the execution, Gary Gilmore's attorney smuggled him some whiskey, which he downed. Johnny Cash, Gilmore's favorite singer, even called Gary on the phone and sang to him. This was a time when the public was very opposed to execution, and there was a lot of sympathy for this man. The legal battle continued behind the scenes, and as late as 7:30 a.m., just 30 minutes before the scheduled execution, no one knew for sure if it was actually going to happen. But at 8 o'clock a.m. on January 17, 1977, the firing squad, made up of local men, assembled. 4 of their 5 weapons were loaded, and 1 would shoot a blank. That way, no one would be sure as to whether or not their gun had the blank in it, and that way it was figured the men would always have a little bit of doubt as to whether or not they were the person that killed another man. Isn't it interesting how we go about this with so much compassion for other people involved and also for the killer? It's such a barbaric act, executing someone, but we have this process. It's really interesting to me. Gary Gilmore took his wristwatch off and smashed it, commemorating the time of his execution. He then asked his Uncle Vern to give that watch to Nicole. He was taken to a concrete room prepared with a large chair in front of a pile of sandbags to catch the bullets. Gilmore was strapped to a chair with leather straps, and a paper target was taped over his chest. That is morbid. That's weird. A black corduroy hood sewed just for this occasion was placed over his head. A wall had been built across the room from the chair that Gary was strapped to, and in that wall were 5 small holes, just big enough for the barrels of each rifle. The firing squad placed their rifles in the holes and prepared themselves. Gary Gilmore was asked if he wanted to say any last words. He replied, "Let's do it." A priest delivered last rites in Latin, and the countdown began. At the end of the countdown, shots rang out. I cannot go into much detail here, but after the shots, a doctor was brought in with a stethoscope. Gary Gilmore was not dead. Witnesses and family members of Gary Gilmore who attended the event cried softly as they waited. Blood pooled on the floor, and the doctor checked again. This time, there was no heartbeat. Gary Gilmore was dead. Many of you may have seen the film starring a young Tommy Lee Jones based on this event. The 1982 movie is called The Executioner's Song, and Jones plays Gary Gilmore in that film. I watched it to prepare for this episode, and it's a good film. It's not streaming anywhere, but it is available to watch here on YouTube, and I will include the link to the film in the description of this episode. I would recommend seeing it if you're interested. It's a decent film. There's a lot of similar themes to Dead Man Walking, a lot to think about on this subject. This is our American justice system. This is our reality. And I think Gary Gilmore wanted to make a point. He failed at many things in life, but I think he succeeded on that. So what did Gary Gilmore request for his last meal? I'm going to show you. Well, this might be one of the sadder little meals that we've covered. A hamburger, a hard-boiled egg, and a bowl of mashed potatoes. And about 6 shots of whiskey that his attorney snuck into him. Boy, that is some Wild West stuff right there, right? Whiskey on death row, unheard of. Here goes. It's a hamburger. It's a hard-boiled egg. I like eggs and all, but last meal, no. And a bowl of mashed potatoes. I love potatoes. I find it incredible that his attorney was able to sneak whiskey into him. They weren't patting people down back then. They weren't checking their pockets. There was no metal detectors. It was just a very different time. But I'm not going to drink 6 shots of whiskey. Sorry. Gary Gilmore, good riddance. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, Dining with the Damned. If you liked the video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more from me. It really does help me a lot. Stay safe and be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.